It was a calm, sunny Saturday morning, the kind of morning that usually makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen. Marie Lewis, a dedicated school teacher in her small town, had a relaxed plan for the day. She was headed to see her mother, just a quick drive through town, a route she had taken countless times. She hummed softly to herself, enjoying the rare peace of an empty car. Marie loved her job, but the classroom was always full of noise. Students asking questions, pencils scribbling, laughter mixed with chatter. So these quiet drives were her little pockets of tranquility, moments where she could just be with her thoughts. As she turned down a familiar street, something caught her eye. The usually quiet neighborhood seemed a bit different today. She couldn't quite place it, but there was a tension in the air, an unease that made her grip the steering wheel just a little tighter. The houses looked the same. Her favorite little bakery was still open on the corner, and the same old trees lined the road. Yet, something felt strange, like she was being watched, or maybe as if something big was just around the corner, waiting. She shook her head, telling herself she was being silly. Marie glanced in her rearview mirror and noticed that a police car had turned onto the street behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. Police cars patrolled these neighborhoods regularly, ensuring the safety of the people who lived there. It wasn't unusual, especially in such a tight-knit community. But as she continued driving, she noticed that the police car didn't take any turns or change lanes. It stayed right behind her, matching her pace, and somehow that small detail made her stomach twist. To shake off the nervous feeling creeping up on her, Marie decided to pull over to the side of the road for a moment, pretending to check her phone. But as soon as she did, the police car pulled over as well, parking just a few feet behind her. She watched in her mirror, waiting to see if they would pass her or simply turn in another direction. Yet there they were, parked, as if watching and waiting. Marie couldn't help but wonder what she could have done wrong. She replayed her drive in her mind. She hadn't been speeding, and she had stopped at every light. She was certain she hadn't broken any traffic laws, but the feeling of uncertainty crept in. Had she missed a signal? Was her taillight out? Her mind raced through all the possibilities. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, telling herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. The police officers got out of their car and started walking toward her. Marie's heart began to race. She had never been in trouble with the law, never even had a speeding ticket. She was the kind of person who followed rules, who did everything by the book. So why were these officers approaching her with such a stern look on their faces? One officer, tall and with a hardened look, approached her window and motioned for her to roll it down. She did, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to keep her voice steady. "Good morning, officer," she said politely, hoping to ease any tension. But the officer didn't return her smile. Instead, he looked at her as though she had already done something wrong. "Do you know why we stopped you?" he asked in a tone that was less of a question and more of an accusation. Marie was taken aback. She shook her head, honestly confused. "No, officer, I don't," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer exchanged a look with his partner, a look that was hard to read but somehow made Marie feel small, like she was suddenly guilty of something she couldn't name. The officer glanced around her car, his eyes moving quickly as if searching for something suspicious. "Where are you headed this morning?" he asked, his tone still sharp. Marie hesitated for a moment, surprised by his question. She wasn't used to being questioned like this. Finally, she gathered her thoughts and answered, "I'm on my way to my mother's house. She lives a few blocks from here." The officer nodded but didn't seem convinced. His partner, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, crossing his arms and giving Marie a long, hard look. "Mind if we take a look around your vehicle, ma'am?" he asked. Marie was startled. She had nothing to hide, of course, but she couldn't understand why they would need to search her car for a simple drive to her mother's. Is there a reason?" she asked cautiously, trying to keep her tone respectful. But the officers didn't answer her question. Instead, they exchanged another look, and Marie could feel a knot of dread forming in her stomach. It was as if they had already decided she was suspicious, as if she was guilty of something just because they thought so. Feeling a mix of fear and confusion, Marie sat frozen in her seat. She had always believed in the goodness of people, had trusted that those in authority would treat her fairly. Yet here she was, facing a situation she had only heard about in news stories, something she never thought would happen to her. She glanced around the street, hoping someone might notice, hoping that someone might help if things went too far. But the street was eerily empty, and she felt more alone than ever. Her heart pounded as she tried to decide what to do. She wanted to cooperate, to show them she had nothing to hide, but a small voice in her head warned her to be careful. She had read enough to know that situations like these could turn sour quickly, even for someone who had done nothing wrong. But how could she stand up for herself without making things worse? Just as she was about to respond, one of the officers glanced over her car, looking down at her tires and around the rear. His gaze was cold, almost like he was challenging her. He stepped back and spoke to his partner in a low voice, just out of her hearing range. She felt her palms sweat as she watched them talk, wondering what they were saying, why they seemed so focused on her car. What were they looking for? And why did they seem so determined to find something, anything, to pin on her? Suddenly, a thought hit her. She remembered her husband, Malcolm, who was on his way to meet her at her mother's house. Malcolm was a strong, confident man, someone who didn't shy away from confrontation when necessary. He had always told her to call him if she was ever in trouble. Maybe this was one of those times, but would calling him make things worse? Would the officers see it as an act of defiance? In the quiet of her car, she felt torn, her mind racing between options. She could sense that this wasn't just a routine stop. There was something more behind the way the officers looked at her, something she couldn't quite understand, but that felt dangerous. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, their unspoken accusations pressing down on her, as though they were waiting for her to make a wrong move. Marie took a slow, steadying breath, trying to clear her mind. She thought of her mother, the warmth of her kitchen, the smell of freshly baked bread, the sense of safety she felt there. That was where she was supposed to be today, spending time with family, not here on the side of the road, caught in a situation that was growing stranger by the second. The officers hadn't left. They seemed to be waiting, watching her every move, as if daring her to do something they could use against her. She thought about calling Malcolm again, about asking for his help, but the fear of escalating the situation held her back. She didn't want things to get worse, but she didn't know how to make them better either. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. Finally, the officer returned to her window, his face expressionless, his tone clipped. "We're going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, as though it was the most natural request in the world. As soon as Marie unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of her car, a sense of dread filled the air. She had barely shut the door when a police cruiser, its lights flashing silently, pulled up right behind her. The brightness of the red and blue lights bounced off the windows of her car, casting strange shadows along the quiet street. She could feel her heart pounding harder as she turned and saw two police officers stepping out of the cruiser. The look on their faces made her feel cold, even though the sun was still shining brightly. The officers walked toward her slowly, their expressions unreadable yet somehow unfriendly. One of them had a small smirk that made Marie feel uneasy, as though he found some twisted amusement in the situation. This was no routine stop. She could tell by the way they looked at her, almost like they had already decided she had done something wrong, something unforgivable. She could sense that they weren't there to help or even to ask her a few questions politely. No, they seemed like they were there to confront her, to make her feel small and powerless. Marie forced herself to stay calm, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She had always been a patient and respectful person, someone who didn't like confrontation and preferred peace. But this felt different. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here she was, standing on the side of the road, with two officers glaring at her as though she was some kind of criminal. It didn't make any sense, and the feeling of confusion mixed with fear was beginning to make her heart race even faster. The first officer, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stern expression, was the first to speak. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone flat, but edged with an authority that left no room for questions. Marie felt a rush of irritation but kept it hidden. She didn't want to make things worse. She had learned over the years that sometimes it was best to stay quiet, to not challenge authority, especially when the situation felt this tense. Without a word, she reached back into her car, her hand steady despite the anxiety bubbling inside her. She handed her documents to the officer, hoping that this would be enough to satisfy him. But instead of looking at her license or registration, he simply held them, his eyes locked on her as though he was waiting for her to say something, waiting for her to make some kind of mistake. She felt his gaze heavy on her, piercing, and for a moment she struggled to hold eye contact. "What brings you here today?" he asked, his voice sharp. It sounded more like an accusation than a simple question. Mary paused, feeling her throat tighten. She didn't understand why he was asking. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't broken any laws. She was simply driving, just like any other day. But his question made her feel like she needed to defend herself, as though she owed him an explanation for simply being there. "I was just visiting my mother," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. She didn't feel like saying much more. Something in his tone made her feel that no matter what she said, he would find a way to twist it, to make it sound suspicious or wrong. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a shorter man with a serious, almost blank expression. They seemed to share a silent conversation, a look that was filled with judgment, and perhaps even something darker. Then the first officer turned back to her, his gaze hardening. "You seem nervous," he said, his tone shifting to something more probing. Marie felt a chill run down her spine. Nervous? Of course she was nervous. She was standing on the side of the road, with two officers staring her down for no reason she could understand. But she couldn't tell him that. She knew that any hint of frustration or fear could be used against her, twisted to fit some narrative they had already formed. "Unjust." A bit surprised, she replied, trying to keep her voice calm, though she could feel her hands starting to tremble. "I didn't realize I had done anything wrong." The officer raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening just slightly. "Well, we'll see about that," he said, as though he knew something she didn't, as though he had already decided she was guilty of something. Marie felt her pulse quicken. There was something deeply unsettling in his tone, something that made her feel as though she was trapped. The second officer stepped forward now, joining his partner, his eyes scanning her car slowly, deliberately, as though he was looking for something, anything, to accuse her of. Marie could feel the tension building, a silent but heavy pressure that filled the space between them. She had never been in a situation like this before, never felt so judged, so vulnerable. She glanced around, hoping someone might be nearby, someone who could witness what was happening. But the street was empty, and she felt terribly alone. "Is this your vehicle?" the second officer asked, his voice almost mocking, as though he didn't believe her. Marie nodded, confused by his question. Of course, it was her car. She had the paperwork, the registration. Everything was in order. She had nothing to hide. And yet, they looked at her as though she was hiding some dark secret. "Yes, it's mine," she answered, keeping her tone respectful, though she could feel the frustration building within her. She didn't understand why they were treating her like this, why they seemed so determined to make her feel guilty. All she wanted was to get to her mother's house, to spend the day in peace, but instead, she was caught in this strange, frightening situation. The first officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "We're going to need to search the vehicle," he said, his voice low but firm, leaving no room for argument. Marie felt a surge of anger rise within her. A search. For what? She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, knew there was nothing in her car that could possibly be of concern. But she also knew that refusing would only make things worse. "Is there a reason for the search?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, though she could feel her hands clenching into fists by her sides. She didn't want to make them angry, didn't want to escalate the situation, but she couldn't help feeling that this was unfair, that she was being singled out for reasons she couldn't understand. The officer's smirk grew, and he crossed his arms, his gaze piercing. "Let's just say we have our suspicions," he replied, his tone laced with a smugness that made her stomach churn. Marie felt her heart sink. They had already made up their minds about her, already decided that she was guilty of something, even though she knew she wasn't. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at her, as though she was something less than human, as though she was just another problem to be dealt with. Marie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make them understand that she was innocent, that she was just an ordinary woman trying to go about her day. But it was clear that they didn't care, that they had already cast her in a role she didn't deserve. "Please," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just on my way to visit my mother." The first officer rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed by her words. "Sure, that's what they all say," he muttered, exchanging another look with his partner. The second officer nodded, a slight sneer forming on his face. Marie felt her cheeks burn with frustration and humiliation. They didn't believe her, didn't care about her side of the story. They had already made up their minds, and there was nothing she could say to change that. "Step aside," the first officer ordered, motioning toward her car. Marie felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of anger and helplessness. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell them how unfair this was, but she knew it would only make things worse. So she did as they said, stepping back as they began to search her vehicle. The officers moved through her car methodically, opening compartments, rifling through her belongings with little regard for her privacy. They searched every inch, leaving nothing untouched. Marie felt a wave of humiliation wash over her as they dug through her things, tossing items aside carelessly. It was as though they were trying to find something, anything, that would justify their actions, something that would make her look guilty. She watched in silence, her fists clenched, her face burning with frustration and shame. She had done nothing to deserve this, nothing to warrant such treatment. She was just a teacher, a quiet woman who had never caused trouble, never broken the law. And yet, here she was, standing on the side of the road, treated like a criminal for reasons she couldn't understand. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finally finished their search, finding nothing, as she had known they would. But even then, they didn't seem satisfied. The first officer turned to her, his smirk replaced by a look of frustration, as though he was disappointed not to have found anything incriminating. As the minutes passed, Marie could feel the situation growing more intense, more alarming. Every second brought a new surge of anxiety as she stood helplessly by her car, watching the officers as they moved around her. Their body language had shifted, their stance becoming more intimidating, their movements sharper and more intentional. It was clear they weren't simply following protocol anymore. They were playing a different game now, one that seemed designed to make her feel small, powerless, and frightened. One of the officers stepped closer, pointing a finger toward her in a way that felt more like a threat than a gesture. "Step back," he ordered, his voice low and commanding. The authority in his tone was unmistakable, and Mary felt an instinctive urge to comply. But there was something in the way he said it that sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just about making her move. It was about making her submit, making her feel that she had no control in this situation. Reluctantly, Marie took a few steps back, feeling the rough gravel under her feet as she put more distance between herself and her car. Her car had always been a symbol of independence, her trusted companion for countless drives to work, to friends' houses, to quiet afternoons spent exploring back roads. But now, standing a few feet away from it, she felt a strange sense of loss, as if her freedom was slipping away with each step. As she stood there, Trying to keep her breathing steady, one of the officers pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Marie couldn't hear what he was saying, but the low tone of his voice, the way he glanced at her while he spoke, sent her mind racing. Who was he calling? And why did it feel like this was part of some plan? Something they had decided long before she had even pulled over. She watched him, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read his expression. But his face was blank, giving nothing away, and it only made her feel more isolated, more alone. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, a heavy, suffocating feeling that made it hard to think, hard to focus. Her mind raced with questions, each one more frantic than the last. What were they planning? What did they want from her? After a few moments, another police car appeared at the end of the street, its lights flashing silently as it approached. Marie's stomach twisted as she watched it pull up alongside the first car, the engine rumbling softly as it came to a stop. Another officer stepped out, his expression as hard and cold as the others. He was carrying something large in his hand, a container of some sort. Marie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. A gasoline canister. Her mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Gasoline. Her thoughts raced, each one more frantic than the last. Why would they need gasoline? The thought was too horrifying to consider, too outrageous to seem real. And yet, as she stood there, frozen in disbelief, she watched as the officer unscrewed the cap of the canister and tilted it over her car. The smell hit her first, a sharp, pungent scent that made her throat tighten and her eyes sting. Gasoline. The realization crashed over her like a wave, leaving her breathless, her mind spinning. They were pouring gasoline on her car. Her car, her only means of escape, was being drenched in fuel, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The officer moved methodically, pouring the gasoline over the hood, the roof, the sides. Each drop seemed to echo in her ears, a slow, torturous sound that made her heart race faster. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to run, to scream, to do something, anything, to stop them. But her feet felt like they were glued to the ground, her voice trapped in her throat. She glanced around, hoping, praying that someone would see, that someone would come to help her. But the street was empty, the houses silent, and the only sounds were the quiet splashes of gasoline hitting the metal of her car. She felt a crushing sense of isolation, a terrible awareness that she was alone in this, that no one was coming to save her. Her mind raced through every possible scenario, every way she might be able to get out of this. But with each passing second, her options seemed to shrink, leaving her with nothing but fear and helplessness. She thought of calling out, of trying to reason with them, but one look at their faces told her it would be pointless. They were beyond reason, beyond empathy. They had made up their minds, and there was nothing she could say that would change that. Then one of the officers pulled something small and dark from his pocket, a lighter. Marie's heart leaped into her throat as she realized what he was planning. The fear that had been building in her chest exploded into full-blown panic, a wild, desperate terror that made her pulse pound in her ears. She wanted to scream, to plead with them to stop, but her voice was locked inside her, trapped by the sheer horror of the situation. She watched in helpless dread as the officer flicked the lighter, the small flame flickering to life in his hand. The sight of it made her feel faint, her knees weak as she imagined the flames spreading, consuming her car in a fiery blaze. This wasn't just an act of intimidation anymore. It was a threat, a promise of destruction. But as she stood there, on the edge of despair, a new thought broke through the haze of fear. Malcolm, her husband, Malcolm, was on his way. He had promised to meet her at her mother's house, and he would notice if she didn't arrive. Malcolm was strong, resilient, and he wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight. He would come for her. She knew he would. The officers didn't know about Malcolm, didn't know what he was capable of. They saw her as an easy target, someone who would break under pressure, someone who would stand there and let them do whatever they wanted. but they had no idea that she had someone who would stand by her, someone who would fight for her. Malcolm had always been protective, always ready to step in when things got tough. He had a quiet strength, a confidence that made people take notice. And he had skills that he rarely spoke about, but that she knew could make a difference. He had a past, a set of experiences that had shaped him into the man he was, and she knew that if he arrived, he would handle this situation in a way that would leave the officers stunned. The flame from the lighter danced in the officer's hand, casting a warm, eerie glow on his face as he held it close to the gasoline-soaked car. Marie felt her hands clench into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to stay calm, to keep her fear in check. She knew she had to hold on, to keep her resolve steady. She couldn't let them see her break. She could feel her heart pounding, each beat a reminder of her determination, her strength. She wasn't going to let them take everything from her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let these men strip away her dignity, her sense of self. She wasn't alone in this. She had Malcolm, and she had her own resilience, a strength she hadn't known she possessed until now. As the officer lowered the lighter, bringing it closer to her car, Marie took a deep breath, her mind racing with thoughts of survival, of escape. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to give up. She would fight, with every ounce of strength she had, and she would hold on to the hope that Malcolm would arrive in time, that he would come through for her the way he always had. The officer's smirk widened as he held the lighter close to the car, his eyes glinting with a strange, twisted satisfaction. But Marie met his gaze with a look of her own, a look that spoke of defiance, of resilience. She wasn't going to let him see her fear, wasn't going to let him take away her courage. She would stand tall, even in the face of this nightmare, and she would hold on to the hope that help was on its way. The flames from the lighter flickered, casting a warm, eerie light that danced across the officer's face, illuminating his expression in a way that sent a chill down Marie's spine. But she kept her gaze steady, her resolve unshaken. She wasn't going to let them break her. She would hold on, she would fight, and she would survive. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, when Marie thought she might be left alone to face this terrible situation, a powerful sound shattered the tension on the street. The screech of tires against the pavement broke through the silence, sharp and commanding, like the arrival of a storm. The officers, so confident just a second before, turned their heads sharply toward the noise, their smug expressions shifting into something more uncertain, more wary. A sleek, dark car had pulled up at the curb, coming to a halt with a determination that seemed almost intentional. And before anyone could react, the driver's door opened, and a tall, solid figure stepped out. Malcolm. He moved with a calm, almost chilling purpose, his eyes focused and steady as he took in the scene in front of him. His face was a mask of cold fury, a quiet rage that lay just beneath the surface, controlled yet unmistakable. Mary felt a surge of relief wash over her, a feeling so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She hadn't been alone after all. Malcolm was here, and he was going to make sure that everything would be all right. She could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way he walked toward her without hesitation, his gaze unwavering as he looked from the officers to her, taking in every detail of the situation with a calm, calculating gaze. The officers watched him approach, their initial confidence fading into something else, something darker. They exchanged a quick, uncertain glance, a silent exchange of worry that they couldn't quite hide. They had been so sure of themselves, so certain that they held all the power. But now, with Malcolm standing before them, that confidence seemed to waver, like a flame flickering in the wind. Malcolm stopped a few steps away from them, his stance relaxed yet strong, a quiet authority radiating from him that made it impossible to look away. He stood tall, his shoulders square, his gaze steady and unflinching. There was a silence that settled over the street, a tense, heavy silence that seemed to hold everyone in place, waiting for the next move. "Is there a problem here?" Malcolm's voice was low, calm, but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't here to play games. His tone was firm, each word carrying a weight that demanded respect, that left no room for argument. He looked directly at the officers, his eyes sharp and focused, as if he could see right through them, as if he already knew everything they had done, everything they had planned. The officers shifted uncomfortably, the smug smirks they had worn moments before fading into something more guarded, more cautious. They had been so sure of their control, so certain of their power over Marie. But Malcolm's presence had changed everything. His calm authority, his quiet strength, left them with a sense of unease that they couldn't quite shake, a feeling that perhaps they had made a mistake, that perhaps they had underestimated the situation. One of the officers, the taller one with the hardened face, straightened up, trying to regain some of his earlier confidence. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out a little too loud, a little too forced. "Sir, this is a police matter," he said, trying to sound authoritative, trying to reassert his control. But there was a slight tremor in his voice, a small hint of uncertainty that betrayed his true feelings. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the officer. "A police matter," he repeated, his tone calm but with a hint of skepticism that cut through the officer's words like a knife. "From where I'm standing, it looks more like intimidation, harassment." His voice was steady, each word precise, as if he was laying out a truth that couldn't be denied, a truth that demanded to be acknowledged. The officer's face flushed, his earlier confidence slipping away as Malcolm's words sank in. He opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, but no words came out. He glanced at his partner, his eyes flickering with a silent plea for support, but the other officer looked just as uncertain, just as thrown off by Malcolm's unexpected arrival. Malcolm took a step closer, his gaze hard and unyielding. "This isn't going to go the way you think," he said, his voice ringing out in the quiet street, strong and unwavering. There was something in his tone, something that sent a shiver down Marie's spine, a feeling of power, of certainty, that made it clear he was in control now, that the balance of power had shifted in an instant. As he spoke, Malcolm reached into his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate, as if to give the officers time to see what he was about to do. He pulled out a small worn leather badge case, the kind that spoke of years of use, of experience, of authority. He held it up, flipping it open to reveal a badge, a symbol of power and respect that left no doubt as to his authority. But this wasn't just any badge. It was one that carried weight, that commanded attention. It was a federal badge, one that placed him above the local jurisdiction, one that gave him the power to override their authority. The officers' eyes widened as they took in the sight of the badge, their earlier confidence crumbling into shock, into disbelief. This was a development they hadn't anticipated, a twist they hadn't prepared for. They had seen Malcolm as just another bystander, another powerless figure who could be ignored, dismissed. But now, faced with his badge, with the quiet authority that radiated from him, they realized they had misjudged him completely. The taller officer stammered, his face pale, his voice shaky. We didn't know." He began, his words trailing off as he struggled to find an explanation, an excuse, something that would justify their actions, something that would make this all go away. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his gaze cold and unrelenting. "Didn't know what?" he asked, his tone icy, his words cutting through the officer's excuses like a blade. "Didn't know that harassing an innocent woman was wrong. Didn't know that abusing your power would have consequences." His voice was calm, controlled, but there was a fire behind his words, a quiet fury that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just about Murray. It was about something bigger, about standing up to injustice, about holding those in power accountable for their actions. The officers exchanged a panicked glance, their earlier smugness replaced by a desperate fear, a realization that they were no longer in control, that they had lost the upper hand. They had thought they could intimidate Marie, that they could bend her to their will without consequences. But now, faced with Malcolm's unwavering gaze, With the authority he wielded, they knew they had overstepped, that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Malcolm took another step forward, his gaze never wavering. "You're going to explain yourselves," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. "Every action you took, every decision you made. I want to hear it all." His tone was commanding, leaving no room for argument, no room for escape. He was in control now, and the officers knew it. The taller officer swallowed hard, his face pale, his hand shaking as he tried to compose himself. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, but the words came out in a stammer, broken and uncertain. We thought she was acting suspiciously," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his expression hard. "Suspiciously," he repeated, his tone filled with disbelief. "A woman driving down the street, minding her own business, is suspicious to you." His words were sharp, his gaze piercing, as if he could see right through the officer's excuses, right through his lies. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground, unable to meet Malcolm's eyes. He knew he had no defense, no justification that would hold up under Malcolm's scrutiny. He had been caught, exposed, and there was nothing he could say that would make it right. Malcolm turned his gaze to the second officer, his expression unrelenting. "And you?" he asked, his voice cold. "What's your excuse?" The second officer stammered, his face pale, his hands trembling as he struggled to find a response. But there was no excuse, no explanation that could justify their actions, and he knew it. Malcolm took a deep breath, his gaze shifting between the two officers, his expression hard. "You abused your power," he said, his voice filled with quiet anger. "You thought you could intimidate her, frighten her, just because you wear a badge. But you were wrong." His words hung in the air, heavy and final, a statement that left no room for argument. The officers stood there, silent and defeated, their earlier confidence shattered, their power stripped away. They had thought they held all the cards, that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. But now, faced with Malcolm's authority, with the quiet strength that radiated from him, they knew they had lost. Malcolm turned to Marie, his expression softening as he looked at her, his gaze filled with reassurance, with a quiet promise that everything would be all right. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, a feeling of safety that she hadn't felt. Malcolm's presence had shattered the officer's illusion of control, exposing the darkness behind their actions. In the moments that followed his arrival, everything had changed. The smug, dismissive looks they had worn minutes ago faded into panic, confusion, and then desperation. Malcolm's calm, commanding words had broken their confidence, leaving them scrambling to defend themselves, but there was no defense that could stand up to the truth he had revealed. Mary watched as the officers shifted uncomfortably, the realization of their own misdeeds slowly sinking in. They knew they had overstepped, knew that what they had done was wrong. And now, with Malcolm here, they couldn't escape the consequences. The tables had turned completely. They were no longer in a position of power. Instead, they were the ones who would have to answer for their actions. Malcolm stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he watched the officers squirm under his scrutiny. He knew they understood the gravity of their actions, and he wasn't going to let them off easily. His calm but fierce presence was unbreakable, a force that commanded respect and instilled fear in those who had tried to abuse their power. With every passing moment, the officers' arrogance crumbled further, replaced by a growing sense of dread. They knew they were in trouble, knew that there was no going back from what they had done. One of the officers, the taller one with the hardened expression, cleared his throat and tried to speak, his voice shaky and filled with forced politeness. "Sir, we didn't mean any harm," he stammered, his face pale, his earlier confidence gone. He avoided looking directly at Malcolm, his gaze flickering nervously between the ground and the other officer beside him. His words sounded hollow, empty, as though he himself didn't believe them. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his expression unimpressed. He could see right through the officer's attempt to excuse his actions, could see that he was only speaking out of desperation, not out of any true remorse. Didn't mean any harm. Malcolm repeated, his tone cold and unyielding. You poured gasoline on an innocent woman's car. You threatened her, intimidated her, and you did it all because you thought no one would stop you. His words were calm, yet each one struck like a hammer, leaving no room for excuses. The officer swallowed hard, his face turning even paler. He had no response, no defense that could stand up to Malcolm's accusation. He knew that what he had done was wrong, that he had crossed a line, and now he was being held accountable for it. He glanced at his partner, a silent plea for support in his eyes, but the other officer looked just as shaken, just as defeated. Malcolm turned his gaze to the second officer, his expression just as hard, just as unrelenting. And you? He asked, his voice filled with quiet authority. What do you have to say for yourself? The second officer shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling slightly as he looked down at the ground, unable to meet Malcolm's eyes. His voice was barely more than a whisper as he spoke, his words filled with guilt and fear. We didn't think anyone would find out, he muttered, his voice breaking. Malcolm's expression didn't soften. He knew that their regret wasn't for their actions, but for being caught. They had been so sure that they could get away with it, so sure that no one would ever hold them accountable. But now, faced with Malcolm's unwavering gaze, they knew they had been wrong. They had miscalculated, and now they were paying the price. With a calm, steady hand, Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't rush, didn't make any sudden movements. Every action was deliberate, controlled, showing the officers that he was in charge, that he held the power now. He dialed a number, waiting patiently as the call connected, his gaze never leaving the officers, his expression as calm as ever. "Chief, this is Agent Malcolm Lewis," he said, his voice firm and professional. "I need a team here immediately. There's been an incident involving abuse of authority, and I have 2 officers who need to be taken in for questioning." His words were calm, straightforward, leaving no room for doubt about the seriousness of the situation. Murray watched as the officers' faces drained of color, their eyes widening in shock and disbelief. They hadn't expected this. They had thought they could intimidate her, could make her feel powerless, and then walk away without consequence. But now, with Malcolm calling in backup, they realized just how wrong they had been. The taller officer raised a hand, as if to protest, but Malcolm silenced him with a single look, a gaze so fierce that it left the officer frozen, his mouth half open, the words dying on his lips. Malcolm's authority was undeniable, a force that left no room for argument, no room for excuses. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The officers exchanged a panicked glance, their earlier confidence shattered, their arrogance replaced by a fear they couldn't hide. They knew what was coming, knew that they were about to face the consequences of their actions, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As the police cars pulled up, several officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached. Malcolm stepped forward to meet them, his calm, steady presence a stark contrast to the fear and desperation etched across the faces of the 2 officers who had tried to intimidate Marie. He spoke with the arriving officers, explaining the situation in calm, clear terms, his voice carrying a weight of authority that left no room for doubt. The 2 officers who had harassed Marie stood there, their shoulders slumped, their faces pale. They didn't try to argue, didn't try to defend themselves. They knew that they had lost, knew that there was no way out. The tables had turned, and now they were the ones who would face judgment. As one of the arriving officers approached them, handcuffs at the ready, the taller officer tried one last time to appeal to Malcolm, his voice filled with desperation. "Please, sir, it was a mistake," he stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "We didn't mean for it to go this far." Malcolm looked at him, his expression cold and unyielding. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "You poured gasoline on an innocent woman's car. You threatened her, humiliated her, all because you thought you could. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, and now you have to live with the consequences." His words were final, leaving no room for argument, no room for excuses. The officers' faces fell, their earlier defiance replaced by a quiet, resigned fear. They knew that they were defeated, that there was no way to escape the consequences of their actions. As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, they looked down at the ground, unable to meet Malcolm's gaze, unable to look at Marie. Marie watched as the officers were led away, a feeling of relief washing over her, a sense of justice that filled her with a quiet strength. She had faced her worst fear, had stood up to those who had tried to take away her power, her dignity. And now, standing beside Malcolm, she felt a new sense of confidence, a belief in her own strength that she hadn't known she possessed. For the first time that day, Marie allowed herself to smile. It was a small, quiet smile, but it was filled with a sense of triumph, of resilience. She had faced her darkest hour, had stood up to those who had tried to break her, and she had come out stronger. She knew that this experience would stay with her, would shape her, but it would not define her. She was more than this moment, more than the fear they had tried to instill in her. Malcolm turned to her, his gaze softening as he looked at her, a quiet pride in his eyes. He reached out, taking her hand in his, a gesture of reassurance, of support. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice filled with a gentle strength. "They won't hurt you again." His words were a promise, a vow that left no room for doubt. She was safe now, protected, and she knew that with Malcolm by her side, she could face anything that came her way. As they stood together, watching the officers being driven away, Marie felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of closure that filled her with gratitude. She had been through a nightmare, had faced the worst, but she had come out on the other side stronger, more resilient. She knew that she would carry this experience with her, would use it to stand up for herself, to stand up for others who faced similar struggles. And as they walked away, hand in hand, she felt a new sense of purpose, a quiet resolve that filled her with hope. She had faced her darkest hour, had stood up to those who had tried to take away her power, and she had emerged stronger, more determined than ever. As Marie walked away from that street, hand in hand with Malcolm, a quiet sense of peace and strength began to settle within her. The day had started like any other, but it had become something she could never have imagined, a test of her resilience, her courage, and her sense of self. She had faced fear, doubt, and injustice, and had come out stronger. Standing there now, reflecting on all that had happened, she felt a newfound appreciation for her own quiet strength, a strength that had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for a moment like this to emerge. For Marie, this was more than just a story of survival. It was a moment of transformation, a turning point in her life that had shown her who she truly was. She had never thought of herself as someone who could stand up against injustice, who could hold her ground in the face of intimidation. She had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred to avoid conflict, to keep the peace. But now she understood something she hadn't known before. Sometimes strength isn't loud or obvious. Sometimes the greatest courage lies in the quiet, steady resolve to keep going, to stay true to oneself, no matter what challenges arise. As they walked together, the events of the day replayed in her mind, each moment a lesson, each challenge a reminder of what she was capable of. She had faced men who had tried to intimidate her, who had used their power to make her feel small and afraid. And yet, she had held on. She had found the courage to stand firm, to trust that the truth would prevail. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when the fear felt overwhelming, when the weight of the situation threatened to break her. But through it all, she had remained strong. She had held on to her dignity, her integrity, and her belief in what was right. The world had often told Marie that being quiet meant being weak, that if you weren't loud and bold, you couldn't make a difference. But today, she had learned the truth. Strength didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to be bold or brash. True strength could be quiet, gentle, even unnoticed by others. It was the steady resolve to keep going, the silent courage to stand up for what was right, even when no one else was watching. Marie had always been quiet, had always valued peace and kindness. And now she saw that these qualities were not weaknesses. They were her greatest strengths. As she reflected on this, a deep sense of pride filled her heart. She had been underestimated, dismissed, treated as though her quiet nature made her less worthy, less capable. But those who had underestimated her hadn't seen her true strength. They hadn't known that beneath her gentle demeanor lay a courage as solid as steel, a resolve as unbreakable as stone. She thought of the officers' faces, their smug confidence, their belief that she would bend under their pressure. And then she thought of the moment when Malcolm had arrived, when everything had changed, when their arrogance had turned to fear. They hadn't seen it coming. They had thought they held all the power, that they could intimidate her without consequence. But they had been wrong. In that moment, Marie realized something important. The world is full of people like her, quiet individuals who go about their lives without seeking attention, without drawing notice. They are teachers, nurses, caregivers, people who may never stand in the spotlight, but who make a difference every day through their kindness, their dedication, their quiet strength. And often, these are the people who are underestimated, who are seen as weak simply because they don't shout or demand recognition. But what the world doesn't always realize is that these quiet individuals hold a power that runs deep, a strength that comes from within, from a place of integrity and resilience. Mary felt a sense of solidarity with these quiet souls, a deep respect for those who walk softly but carry a strength that few can see. She realized that she was part of something greater, a community of people who may never seek the spotlight, but who embody a quiet courage that is just as powerful, just as important as any loud declaration. And she felt a new sense of purpose, a desire to honor this strength, to stand up for herself and others like her, to show the world that courage doesn't have to be loud to be real. As they neared her mother's house, Marie felt a warmth in her heart, a feeling of triumph that went beyond what had happened on that street. This day, this experience, had changed her. It had shown her what she was capable of, had revealed a strength she hadn't known was there. And as she looked at Malcolm, at the man who had come to her side in her time of need, she felt a deep gratitude, a profound sense of love and respect. He had seen her strength even when she hadn't, had believed in her even when she doubted herself. And for that, she would always be grateful. Together, they had faced something dark, something painful, and together, they had emerged stronger. It was a reminder that true strength often comes from within, from the love and support of those who believe in us, from the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult, even when we are afraid. Marie knew that this experience would stay with her, that it would be a part of her journey, a part of her growth. But she also knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She had faced her fears, had stood up to those who tried to bring her down, and she had found a strength that could not be shaken. As they stepped into her mother's warm, welcoming home, Marie felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of completion, of closure. She had faced her darkest hour, had come out on the other side with a newfound strength, a deeper understanding of herself and her own resilience. And as she looked around at the familiar surroundings, at the home that had always been a place of safety and love, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had survived, she had triumphed, and she knew that she would carry this strength with her always. For Marie, this wasn't just a story of survival. It was a reminder of who she truly was. It was a lesson in courage, in resilience, in the quiet strength that lives within all of us. She knew that there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but she also knew that she was capable of facing them. She had learned that strength doesn't always have to be loud, that sometimes the quietest voices hold the greatest power. And she was ready to embrace that power, to live her life with a newfound sense of confidence and courage. In the end, Marie's journey was a reminder to herself and to others that courage doesn't always look like bold declarations or grand gestures. Sometimes, courage is simply the willingness to keep going, to hold on to what is right, even when the world seems against you. And those who underestimate the quiet ones, who think that silence means weakness, they are the ones who never see it coming, the ones who fail to understand the true nature of strength. Marie smiled softly, a smile filled with the quiet pride of someone who has faced their fears and found their strength. She knew now that she was strong, that she was capable, and that she had the courage to stand up for herself and for others. And as she looked at Malcolm, at the man who had stood by her, who had believed in her, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, a feeling of love and respect that went beyond words. Together, they had faced the darkness, had triumphed over those who tried to bring them down, and together they would continue forward, stronger than ever. For Marie, this was just the beginning, a new chapter in a life filled with quiet strength, with courage, with a determination to live with integrity and resilience. And she knew that no matter what came next, she would be ready.